Jalisco, 1915. The smoke over the agave fields did not come from the ovens. It came from the fields themselves. Cooked agave smells like burnt sugar. Revolutionary columns moved through the valley below the volcano, and the men who owned the distilleries rode out of town at night with what they could carry. Across the state, the number of tequila producers collapsed from 87 to 32. In the town of Tequila itself, half of them simply disappeared. All of this was the middle of a war that would kill somewhere between 1 and 2 million Mexicans out of a population of roughly 15 million, which is one person in every 10. The fields burning that night held a crop that took 8 years to grow. And the crop was a bitter, spiked desert weed that the Spanish crown had once outlawed, taxed, mocked, and tried very hard to replace with wine. That was 1915. But the story of tequila starts thousands of years before a still, a bottle, or a border ever existed in Mexico. Western Mexico, roughly 9,000 years ago. The land here does not forgive. Volcanic soil, thin rainfall, brutal sun for months, and then sudden violent water. Maize struggles. Beans struggle. And growing out of that ground, in tight gray-blue rosettes, was a plant that did not struggle at all. The agave had solved the problem of drought by refusing to breathe during the day. It opened its pores only at night, when the air was cool and the water would not evaporate, and it locked its stomata shut through the daylight hours. It could sit in ground that killed everything else, and simply wait. And inside that waiting, it was building something extraordinary. The agave spends 6 to 12 years pulling every gram of sugar it can manufacture down into a dense core at its base, packing it away like a battery. Then, once, it spends the entire reserve at a single stroke. It throws up a flower stalk that can rise higher than a house, blooms, is pollinated, sets seed, and dies. One flowering, one chance. Everything the plant has saved for a decade is burned in a matter of weeks. For any human being watching, this was a maddening thing to see. Here was a plant sitting in dead ground with more concentrated sugar than anything else in the landscape, and it was completely useless. The leaves were fibrous enough to break teeth. The sap carried saponins that foam like soap and calcium oxalate crystals that burn the skin and close the throat. The tip of every leaf carried a hardened spine that would go straight through a sandal and keep going. Eat it raw, and you got a mouthful of splinters and a burning mouth for your trouble. The sugar was there. It was simply locked. Breaking that lock took fire, patience, and a very specific piece of engineering. The people of western Mexico dug pits into the ground, lined them with stone, and burned hardwood inside them for hours until the rock itself glowed. Then they raked out the coals, laid down a bed of green agave leaves, and stacked the trimmed hearts on top. More leaves, fiber mats, earth shoveled over the whole thing until it was sealed as tight as a tomb. And then they walked away and left it alone for 2 or 3 days. What happened inside that pit was chemistry that nobody in the valley had a word for. The agave stores its sugar as long chains, which the human body cannot use, and which taste of nothing pleasant at all. Sustained low heat over many hours breaks those chains apart into simple sugars. Bitter goes into the ground. Something else comes out. What emerged from those pits was dark, sticky, fibrous, and intensely sweet, closer to a roasted date than to a vegetable, and it was the first concentrated sugar source that these communities had ever controlled. There was a second path, and it was even stranger. If you found a plant just as it began to push up its flower stalk, and you cut the stalk out and scraped a bowl into the exposed core, the agave did not stop. It kept pumping sap upward for months, feeding a flower that no longer existed. A single plant could give several liters a day. That sap is called agua miel, honey water, and left in the open air in a warm climate, it begins to ferment within hours, all by itself. They did not know the word hydrolysis. They were doing it anyway. That was still only half of what the plant could do. Because the agave was never only a food. Strip the flesh from a leaf and you are left with ixtal, a long, tough fiber that was twisted into rope, woven into sandals, knotted into fishing nets, and beaten into a coarse cloth that ordinary people wore for their entire lives. The dried flower stalks became roof beams and fences. The leaves became thatch and fuel. The pulp became a rough paper. The saponins in the sap became soap. The juice was pressed onto wounds. And there is one detail that says everything about how closely these people understood this plant. Pull the terminal spine slowly and carefully out of a leaf, and it comes away with a length of fiber still attached to its base. A needle with the thread already threaded through it, grown on the plant, ready to use. Then there was pulque. The fermented aguamiel was thick, sour, faintly milky, and mildly alcoholic, and it carried something close to religious weight across central Mexico. The maguey was embodied in the goddess Mayahuel. Fermentation itself had a god, Patacatl, and drunkenness had 400 of them. The Senson Totochten, the 400 rabbits, because in Nahuatl, 400 was less a number than a way of saying countless. Every possible variety of intoxication had its own rabbit. The weeping drunk, the singing drunk, the fighting drunk. A civilization that had built a taxonomy of being drunk, and it policed that taxonomy with genuine severity. Pulque was largely restricted to ritual occasions, to the elderly, and to specific festivals. Ordinary people caught drunk in public could have their heads shaved in the street as a mark of shame, and repeated offenses could carry the death penalty. This was not a plant that people grew for pleasure. It was the hardware store, the pharmacy, and the church of an entire civilization, all growing out of the same rosette. Then, the ships arrived. The Spanish who came through western Mexico in the 16th century looked at pulque and saw filth. It was thick where their drinks were clear, sour where theirs were sweet, and it was drunk in ceremonies they had come specifically to destroy. What they actually wanted was brandy and wine, the drinks of home, and the crown made sure of it. Colonial vineyards were discouraged because Spain preferred to sell wine to its colonies rather than let them make their own. So the Spanish in Jalisco found themselves in a difficult position. They had contempt for the local drink, no supply of their own, and no distilling tradition anywhere in Mesoamerica to build on. The solution did not come from Spain. It came from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. From 1565 until the early 19th century, Spanish galleons ran a route between Acapulco and Manila, hauling Chinese silk and porcelain east and Mexican silver west. That crossing took 6 months, and over 2.5 centuries, it deposited a very large number of Filipino sailors and settlers on the Pacific coast of Mexico. Estimates run into the tens of thousands. They brought coconut palms with them. They also brought a still, a squat vessel of clay and bamboo with a bowl of water sitting on top to condense the vapor. Nothing at all like the European alembic with its long copper coil. In Colima, they used it to turn fermented coconut sap into spirit, and by 1631, the town was producing hundreds of thousands of liters of it a year. That coconut spirit fueled the mining camps of the north. And the earliest agave stills recorded in western Mexico look far more like that Filipino design than like anything Spanish. Researchers at the Yucatan Center for Scientific Research assembled botanical, archaeological, toponymic, and ethnohistoric evidence, and concluded that agave distillation in Mexico began by adapting the Filipino coconut technique. Whether every detail of that transmission is settled remains debated among historians, but the physical resemblance of the stills is beyond dispute. And no, that is not something anyone made up. Spain's conquest of the Philippines is the reason the national drink of Mexico exists. The colonial authorities noticed the new product almost immediately, and their response set a pattern that would repeat for 200 years. In 1608, the governor of New Galicia imposed the first taxes on mezcal wine. In 1636, Governor Juan Canseco y Quiñones formally authorized its distillation, because a legal product is a taxable product. By 1651, a Spanish physician was recording that people rubbed it on aching joints to treat rheumatism. Then Madrid changed its mind. In 1785, Charles III banned the production of all spirits in the colony outright, for the straightforward reason that Mexican mezcal was competing with Spanish wine and brandy exports. Production did not stop. Production went underground, in some cases literally, back into the earth pits where the whole thing had started. 10 years later, Charles IV reversed the ban and taxed the product instead, having concluded what governments usually conclude, which is that revenue beats prohibition. Those tax receipts helped pay for the University of Guadalajara. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. One family had been waiting for exactly this moment. In 1795, the same year the ban was lifted, José María Guadalupe Cuervo received from the Spanish crown the first official license to produce vino mezcal de tequila commercially. The Cuervos had been working agave land near the town for decades already. What they now held was something no rival possessed. Written permission from the same empire that had spent the previous 10 years trying to stamp the drink out, to make it legally and sell it openly. A single sheet of paper turned a clandestine village product into a business with a name. The second figure arrived 78 years later, and he did something more radical. In 1873, Zenobio Souza bought a distillery in the town of Tequila and began asking a question nobody had bothered with. There were dozens of agave species being thrown into the ovens, all of them slightly different, all of them producing slightly different spirit. Souza looked at the variety with the blue-gray leaves, Agave tequilana, and concluded it was better than the rest. More sugar, more consistency, better yield. He pushed his neighbors towards it. That single decision is why every bottle labeled tequila on Earth today comes from one plant. Souza was also the man who took it out of Mexico. He loaded barrels north across the border in the 1870s, and in 1893 his product collected medals at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, standing on a table in the American Midwest next to the finest spirits Europe could send. There is a story that he once rode out and defended his agave fields against bandits personally. Whether every detail of that is accurate remains debated, but the commercial result is beyond dispute. Then the infrastructure arrived. The railway linking Guadalajara to Mexico City was completed in 1888, and suddenly, barrels that had moved by mule train moved by locomotive. Production climbed hard. By 1906, official records put output in Jalisco at roughly 8 million gallons a year. Think about that for a second. A drink that had been illegal within living memory, made from a weed in a dusty town under a volcano, was now an industrial export with medals from Chicago on the wall. Histories like this rarely reach a classroom, so if you value deep historical investigations, subscribe before the next one. Everything that made that success possible was also building the conditions for a catastrophe, and the man at the center of it had been president of Mexico since 1876. Porfirio Diaz ruled for most of 35 years, and the surface of his Mexico looked like progress. Railways crossed the country. Telegraph lines followed them. Foreign capital arrived in enormous quantities. The town of Tequila itself got electric light, a railway connection, and modern boilers. And the great tequila families grew from distillers into dynasties. Underneath that surface, Diaz had constructed something else entirely, a legal machine for moving land from the people who worked it to the people who financed him. The mechanism was the survey company. Private firms were licensed to go out and identify vacant national land, and they were paid in a share of whatever they found. The definition of vacant was the trap. Villages across Mexico had farmed the same ground for centuries under customary right, with no paper title, because paper title had never been the point. Under the new laws, land without documents was land without owners. Official Porfirian government reporting from a single 5-year window records roughly 2.39 million hectares handed over to survey companies, which is an area larger than the state of New Jersey. The families living on it were not consulted. They were reclassified. What happened to them next was the estate store. A dispossessed family became labor on the hacienda that now held the deed, and wages arrived not as coins, but as credit at the tienda de raya, the company store, where prices were set by the landowner. Debt accumulated at marriage, at baptism, at burial, and it did not die with the man who owed it. It passed to his children. In 1910, the American journalist John Kenneth Turner published an account estimating that around 5 million people, roughly a third of Mexico's population, lived under some form of debt bondage. Later, historians have narrowed his scope considerably and disputed his numbers. Not one of them disputes that the system existed. And in the agave fields, that system had a very specific physical shape. The gimador worked with a coa de gima, a flat circular blade on a long wooden shaft, sharpened until it removed a spined leaf in one stroke. He worked bent forward, stripping a plant down until the bare core stood exposed like a gray stone, then cutting it free at the root. That core, the piña, weighs between 40 and 80 kilograms, which is the weight of a grown adult, and it has to be lifted. A skilled man handled 100 plants in a day, every day, in direct sun, for wages he could only spend in one shop. The plant took 8 years to be ready. 8 years. He got one morning with it. Elsewhere, the same government was doing worse. In Sonora, Diaz's administration seized Yaqui land in the river valleys and answered resistance with deportation, shipping thousands of Yaqui men, women, and children south by train to labor on plantations far from home. This was not a policy failure at the edges of an otherwise functional state. This was the state working exactly as designed. It broke on 20th of November 1910. What began as an electoral dispute became a decade of general war, and the fighting was worst precisely where the land question was sharpest. Armies moved through Jalisco repeatedly. Haciendas burned. Distilleries were seized, stripped, or abandoned. Estimates of the total dead across the revolutionary decade range from 1 million to 2 million people in a country of about 15 million. And when the shooting finally slowed, it started again. In 1926, the Calles Law set the government against the Catholic Church, and the Cristero Rebellion erupted across the West, with Jalisco at its heart. The historian Jean Meyer puts the deaths between 1926 and 1929 at roughly 90,000. This is the part that should make you angry. The center of that second war was Los Altos de Jalisco, the highlands east of Guadalajara. Today, Los Altos is where the most expensive agave in the world is grown, and its name appears on bottles as a mark of quality. 2 generations ago, it was a killing ground, and the men doing the killing and the dying on both sides were largely the sons of families who had lost their land under the survey laws 30 years earlier. This was not simply a revolution against an unpopular president. It was a revolution against a system of land ownership made catastrophically worse by 3 decades of paperwork designed to make dispossession look legal. The consequences rippled far beyond Jalisco. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans crossed north into the United States during the Revolutionary years, carrying their food, their music, and their drink into Texas, Arizona, and California. And then, in January 1920, the United States government did something that nobody in Jalisco had asked for, and nobody could have predicted. It banned alcohol. What followed was a smuggling economy with its own name. The tequileros ran bottles across the Rio Grande on donkeys and horses, through paths their families had used for generations, in a border country where checkpoints sat 50 miles apart, and half the population had relatives on the other side. Tequila and cognac were the favorites. For 13 years, a Mexican peasant spirit was one of the most reliably available drinks in the American Southwest, and an entire generation of Americans acquired the taste illegally. A law written in Washington to stop Americans from drinking is the single largest reason Americans drink tequila. The second wave came 20 years later. During the Second World War, American distilleries were converted to producing industrial alcohol for the war effort, and shipments of European wine and spirits stopped almost entirely. Demand crossed the border again, and it did not come back. Between 1940 and 1950, the area planted with agave in Mexico expanded by roughly 110%. But here is the strange and unexpected part of the story. The revolution should have finished tequila. It burned the estates, halved the producers, wrecked the export trade, and killed a tenth of the country. Instead, it made tequila permanent. And it did so for a reason that has nothing to do with agriculture. The Porfirian elite had drunk French cognac and Bordeaux, had built their houses in the French style, and had modeled their taste on Paris. Rejecting that class meant rejecting its bottles. Tequila was what the men in the field drank, and after 1920, that was the entire point. Eladio Souza, who took over the family firm in 1909 and spent the following years watching the revolution threaten to expropriate everything he owned, spent the decades after it tying tequila directly to national feeling. Then, Mexican cinema arrived and finished the job, putting a charro on a horse with a bottle in his hand in film after film. The catastrophe did not end the drink. It handed it a flag. The United States resisted longest and surrendered hardest. For decades, tequila was a border curiosity in America, a cheap novelty associated with Tijuana weekends and bad decisions. The margarita changed that, and then premium bottling changed it again. In 2024, the United States imported 334.9 million liters of tequila, which was more than 80% of everything Mexico shipped, and the figure had risen from the year before. There is now a generation of American drinkers who order tequila neat and would be offended by salt and lime. The drink that crossed the Rio Grande on a donkey is a luxury category in the country that once banned it. Spain came next, which carries a certain irony. This is the country whose king outlawed the production of Mexican spirits in 1785, specifically to protect Spanish wine and brandy from competition. 240 years later, Spain sits among the largest importers of tequila in the world and consistently ranks first or second in Europe. Spanish bars serve it as a chupito, a short, sharp shot alongside the national spirits it was once suppressed to protect. The commercial argument that Charles III lost by decree, Mexico eventually won on the shelf. Japan resisted differently. In the middle of the 20th century, as tequila's international reputation grew, imitation products appeared in Asian markets, and Javier Souza spent years fighting producers who used the name without any connection to Jalisco. That fight was one of the pressures that pushed Mexico towards formal legal protection of the term. Japan today is a member of the top 10 importing countries, and the fight over the word tequila is the reason the word now means something enforceable. China arrived last and arrived fast. Chinese demand moved in and out of the top 10 importing nations over the past decade, and in January 2025, it returned to that list alongside Colombia and Australia. Tequila is now sold in more than 120 countries. A spirit that was illegal in its own homeland in 1785, and that was made in a town of a few thousand people, is now a globally regulated category with a legally defined territory. The numbers underneath that are difficult to picture. In 2024, Mexican producers made 495.8 million liters of tequila and exported 400.3 million of them, consuming 1.8 million tons of agave in the process. In 2025, exports reached 407.98 million liters, and agave consumption rose to 2.19 million tons. Behind those figures stand 206 registered producers, 42,441 agave farmers, and 2,091 brands. In 2006, UNESCO listed the agave landscape around the town of Tequila as a World Heritage Site. There is a shadow across all of it. Because the industry propagates agave from clonal offshoots rather than seed, the plants are harvested before they ever flower, which means the long-nosed bats that pollinate them find nothing waiting. Rodrigo Medellin of the National Autonomous University of Mexico has stated that blue agave has now lost more than 99.9% of its genetic diversity. In the mid-1990s, a wave of fungal disease moved through fields of genetically identical plants and killed them at enormous scale. A monoculture has no second answer. But tequila is far more than a drink, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. In 2008, Javier Morales, Luis Miguel Apatiga, and Victor Castaño were growing diamond films in a Mexican laboratory using diluted ethanol as the carbon source, and they noticed that the ideal ratio, roughly 40% alcohol to 60% water, was the exact composition of tequila blanco. Apatiga bought a small bottle of cheap white tequila on his way to work. Heated to 850 degrees Celsius and deposited onto silicon and stainless steel, it produced genuine diamond crystallites between 100 and 400 nanometers across. 8 years later, Ford and Jose Cuervo began testing the leftover agave fiber from distillation as a bioplastic for wiring harnesses, ventilation housings, and storage bins. It fed them. It clothed them. It buried them. It was roasted in pits 9,000 years ago, banned by a Spanish king, licensed by his successor, loaded onto a railway, burned in a revolution, smuggled across a river on a donkey, put in the hand of a film star, poured in 120 countries, and finally turned into diamonds in a laboratory in Querétaro. Not bad for a bitter, spiked desert weed. Drop a comment telling us which stage of tequila's journey surprised you most. The Filipino sailors who brought the still, the king who outlawed the drink, or the laboratory that turned it into diamonds.